On November 24th, 1991, Roger Taylor was preparing to visit one of his oldest friends. The friend was Freddie Mercury. By then, Roger knew the situation was serious. Freddie had become terribly weak, and the people closest to him understood that time was running out. Only the day before, Queen's singer had publicly confirmed what many had already feared. He had AIDS. The statement was brief. Freddie asked for privacy, thanked those who had supported him, and encouraged people around the world to join the fight against the disease. Roger never reached him. While he was on his way, the telephone call came. Freddie was gone. He was only 45 years old. For millions of people, that call marked the death of one of the greatest performers popular music had ever seen. For Roger, it meant something far more personal. He had lost the man he had known before the stadiums, before the gold records, before Bohemian Rhapsody, and before the name Queen meant anything to anyone outside a small group of hopeful musicians in London. Years later, Roger was asked which person from his past he would choose to have one more conversation with. He did not hesitate. Freddie. Roger said he wished he had been able to say goodbye. That regret is one of the quietest parts of Roger Taylor's story. He has spent decades performing Queen's songs in front of enormous crowds. He has watched audiences raise their hands during Radio Gaga. He has heard entire arenas sing Freddie's words back to him. He has helped keep the band's music alive for generations who were not even born when Queen played Live Aid. Yet, none of that could give him back the conversation he missed that November afternoon. Roger Taylor is now 77 years old. To most people, he remains the powerful drummer behind Queen, the blonde musician whose high harmonies and explosive playing helped give the band its unmistakable sound. He wrote major hits of his own, including Radio Gaga and A Kind of Magic. He experienced the kind of success that young musicians usually cannot imagine. Packed stadiums, private aircraft, #1 records, wealth, and an audience spread across the world. But the final decades of his life have also been shaped by absence. Freddie died. John Deacon eventually withdrew from public life and left the band behind. The original Queen, 4 very different men whose personalities somehow fitted together, disappeared piece by piece. Roger and Brian May remained in public, carrying a name that had once belonged equally to all 4 of them. That is the painful contradiction at the heart of Roger Taylor's life. Queen never truly went away, but the Queen he knew could never return. His friendship with Freddie had begun under very different circumstances. In the late 1960s, they were young men trying to survive in London. Roger was playing with Brian May in a group called Smile. Freddie, still known to many as Freddie Bulsara, followed the band closely and insisted that he understood what it could become. Roger and Freddie also sold second-hand clothing from a stall in Kensington Market. Long before they were photographed stepping out of limousines, they stood behind a counter together, surrounded by fabric, customers, noise, and the uncertainty of not knowing whether their musical ambitions would lead anywhere. They were different, but they recognized something in each other. Roger had the confidence and appearance of a rock star before he was one. Freddie had an imagination too large for the small clubs where they were performing. He talked about presentation, theater, clothing, and the power of making an audience look at you before they had even heard a note. Some people found Freddie excessive. Roger found him fascinating. When Smile's singer Tim Stoffel left, Freddie stepped forward. He wanted the band. He wanted a new name. He wanted Queen. Roger and Brian agreed, although neither of them could have understood how completely that decision would shape the rest of their lives. More than 50 years later, Roger can still close his eyes and remember Freddie before the world claimed him. Not the untouchable figure in the yellow jacket at Wembley, but the young man beside him in a London market, making plans that sounded impossible. And perhaps that is why the goodbye Roger never gave still matters so much. He did not merely lose Queen's singer. He lost one of the last people who remembered who he had been before Queen existed. Long before Roger Taylor played beneath towering lights in front of tens of thousands of people. He was a boy in Cornwall trying to make a collection of mismatched drums sound like the records he loved. Roger Meadows. Taylor was born in King's Lynn, Norfolk, in July 1949. His family later moved to Truro, a quiet cathedral city in Cornwall, far from the London clubs where the next generation of British rock musicians was beginning to gather. There was nothing in those early surroundings to suggest that Roger would one day become part of one of the largest bands in the world. Music entered his life gradually. He started with a ukulele, experimented with guitar, and sang in a school choir. But drums gave him something the other instruments did not. They allowed him to lead without standing at the front. He could control the speed, the tension, and the force of a song from behind everyone else. As a teenager, Roger joined local groups, including Johnny Quayle and The Reaction. When the original singer left, Roger began singing as well as playing drums. His voice was high, rough, and immediately recognizable, even before he fully understood how valuable it would become. The band played dances, local halls, and clubs around Cornwall. They traveled in old vehicles, carried their own equipment, and performed for audiences who were sometimes more interested in dancing than listening carefully. Roger was not famous, but around Truro, he was already known as someone who took music seriously. His parents, however, expected him to build a more reliable life. In 1967, Roger left Cornwall for London and began studying dentistry. It was the kind of respectable profession that promised security, but Roger later admitted that getting to London mattered more to him than becoming a dentist. London was where the music was happening. The city was crowded with young artists, students, and musicians who believed that something new was being created almost every week. Jimi Hendrix had changed what people expected from a guitarist. Cream had made blues louder and heavier. The Beatles were turning albums into complete artistic statements rather than collections of singles. Roger wanted to be near all of it. One day, a friend told him about an advertisement placed on a notice board at Imperial College. A guitarist and singer were looking for a drummer in the style of Ginger Baker or Mitch Mitchell. Roger answered the advertisement. The guitarist was Brian May, a physics student with an unusual homemade instrument that he and his father had built together. The singer and bass player was Tim Staffel. Roger auditioned, impressed them, and became the drummer for their group, Smile. The three young men had ambition, but very little certainty. They rehearsed where they could, carried their equipment through London, and played shows that rarely paid enough to justify the effort. Smile opened for established acts, and even appeared at the Royal Albert Hall, yet the breakthrough they expected never arrived. Freddie Bulsara was often nearby. He was Tim Staffel's friend from art college, a thin young man with long hair, striking clothes, and an absolute belief in his own instincts. He attended Smile's performances, offered suggestions, and talked openly about what the group was missing. Freddie did not speak like someone asking for permission. He spoke as though the future had already happened, and he was simply explaining it to everyone else. Roger was drawn to that confidence. Away from the rehearsal room, the two became close. Roger and Freddie spent time together in London and ran a stall selling clothing at Kensington Market. The market was crowded, colorful and noisy, filled with second-hand garments, scarves, jewelry, and young people trying to create identities different from those of their parents. There, Roger and Freddie stood side by side before either of them had money or status. They watched customers pass, argued about music, and imagined careers that still existed only in their conversations. Freddie had studied art and design, and he understood clothing as part of performance. He did not believe a rock band should simply walk onto a stage and play well. It should look unforgettable before the first note was heard. When Tim Staffel finally left Smile in 1970, the group appeared to be finished. Freddie saw an opening. He joined Roger and Brian as their singer and pushed for a new name, Queen. Brian and Roger were uncertain at first. The name sounded grand, provocative, and almost absurd for three musicians who were still struggling to find regular work. That was exactly why Freddie wanted it. Several bass players passed through the group before John Deacon joined in 1971. Quiet, technically skilled, and very different from the other three, John completed the balance they had been missing. The classic Queen lineup was finally together. They had no major record contract, no money, and no guarantee that audiences would understand them. What they did have was a guitarist with a sound no one else could reproduce, a precise and inventive bass player, a singer who behaved as though arenas were already waiting, and a drummer whose power could hold all of it together. The world had not heard Queen yet, but Roger Taylor had already found the three men who would define the rest of his life. By the time Queen began filling arenas, Roger Taylor had become one of the most recognizable drummers in rock music. He had the blonde hair, the sharp features, and the restless energy of someone who looked as though he could just as easily have been standing at the front of the stage. During concerts, he sat behind a large drum kit, often surrounded by smoke and lights, striking with enough force to be heard beneath Brian May's layered guitar and Freddie Mercury's enormous voice. But Roger was never simply the man keeping time. From Queen's earliest recordings, he wanted his own voice to be heard, literally. His high, rough-edged harmonies became an important part of the band's sound. On songs such as Bohemian Rhapsody, Roger could reach notes that gave the vocal arrangement its almost impossible height. Freddie's voice carried the melody, but Roger's voice helped create the wall of sound around it. He was also writing. On Queen's first album, Roger contributed Modern Times Rock and Roll, a fast and aggressive song that he sang himself. As the band developed, his compositions revealed a personality that was different from Freddie's theatrical romanticism or Brian May's thoughtful, carefully constructed style. Roger's songs were often direct, loud, and slightly rebellious. One of the earliest became one of Queen's most unusual fan favorites. I'm in Love with My Car appeared on the 1975 album A Night at the Opera. Roger wrote it as a dramatic love song, except the object of affection was not a woman. It was an automobile. He sang the lead vocal and gave the track such conviction that the joke never completely overwhelmed the music. The song was placed on the B-side of Bohemian Rhapsody, a decision that later became part of Queen folklore. Because royalties were connected to both sides of a single, Roger reportedly earned heavily from a song that received far less attention than Freddie's masterpiece. The other members teased him about it for years, yet the episode showed something important. Roger Taylor was not content to be treated as a supporting musician. He had ideas, ambition, and a sense of identity that existed outside the drum kit. In 1977, while Queen were still at the height of their rise, Roger became the first member of the band to release a solo single. A few years later, he released his first solo album, Fun in Space. He played much of the material himself and used the project to explore sounds that did not always fit naturally inside Queen. It would have been easy for the other members to see solo work as a threat. Queen contained 4 strong personalities, and all 4 eventually wrote major songs. Arguments were common. Decisions about singles, arrangements, and songwriting credits could become intense. Roger later described the band as a kind of family, but families do not avoid conflict simply because they love one another. At times, Queen's success seemed to make those differences larger. Freddie wanted spectacle. Brian could spend long hours perfecting the smallest musical detail. John Deacon was quieter, but fiercely protective of his own composition. Roger was impatient, outspoken, and rarely afraid to say when he disliked something. That combination could be exhausting. It was also one of the reasons Queen survived. No single person controlled everything. Each member brought songs into the studio, and each could challenge the others. Roger might arrive with a rough idea, created on a synthesizer or piano rather than drums. Freddie would reshape the vocal. Brian would add guitar lines. John would change the foundation underneath it. The finished song could sound completely different from the original demo, but the tension often improved it. That is what happened with Radio Gaga. Roger began developing the song after hearing his young son use the phrase radio caca. He turned it into a reflection on the days when families gathered around the radio and trusted it to bring news, drama, and music into their homes. The song carried nostalgia, but it was not slow or sentimental. It had electronic drums, synthesizers, and a chorus designed for thousands of hands to move together. Released in 1984, Radio Gaga became one of Queen's largest international successes. It reached #1 in 19 countries and gave the band one of the most memorable audience participation moments in rock history. The following year, at Live Aid, the crowd at Wembley Stadium performed those handclaps almost as one body. Roger was seated behind the drums, watching a song he had written connect with people in a way no private success could match. Then came A Kind of Magic, another Roger composition that Freddie helped reshape. Released in 1986, it gave its name to an album and to the final tour Queen would ever perform with Freddie. By then, Roger had everything he had once imagined in Kensington Market. He was wealthy, famous, and respected. His songs belonged to millions of people. He had also formed another group, The Cross, giving himself a place where he could sing at the front rather than remain behind the kit. From the outside, his life looked almost impossibly complete. But some of Roger's most reflective writing was still ahead of him. He had always written about speed, rebellion, technology, and the strange pressures of modern life. Soon, however, his songs would begin looking backward. They would speak about childhood, family, memories and days that disappeared before anyone understood how precious they were. Inside Queen, something was changing. Freddie was still working, still joking, and still refusing to be treated as fragile. But those closest to him could see the difference. The man who had once seemed capable of commanding any room was beginning to fight a battle that even his bandmates could not win for him. After Queen completed the Magic Tour in August 1986, the silence that followed felt unusual. For more than a decade, the band had lived according to a familiar rhythm. They made an album, promoted it, packed their equipment, and traveled from one country to another. The concerts became larger every year. By 1986, they were performing in stadiums across Europe, with Freddie Mercury moving across enormous stages as though they belonged to him. No one watching those performances knew that Queen would never tour with Freddie again. The official explanation was simple. The band needed a break. They had spent years working under intense pressure, and Freddie had grown tired of the physical demands of touring. Behind closed doors, however, the situation was becoming more serious. Roger Taylor and the others began noticing changes in their friend. Freddie was losing weight. His energy was no longer as reliable as it had once been. Questions about his health appeared in the British press, but he refused to discuss them publicly. Inside the band, the subject was handled differently. Freddie eventually told his bandmates that he was seriously ill. The exact timing of every conversation remains private, and Roger has never turned those moments into public spectacle. What is clear is that Brian, Roger and John understood the truth before the wider world did. They also understood what Freddie wanted from them. He did not want sympathy in the recording studio. He did not want long conversations about dying. He wanted to work. Queen returned to the studio and made The Miracle, released in 1989. The four members agreed to credit the songs to Queen rather than fight over individual ownership. After years in which songwriting royalties had occasionally created tension, the decision brought them closer together. Time had suddenly become more important than credit. They began recording Innuendo during sessions in London and Montreux. Freddie's health changed from week to week, so the work was arranged around what he could manage. On stronger days, he entered the vocal booth and recorded as much as possible. On more difficult days, the others worked on instruments, arrangements, and material that could be completed later. Roger watched a man who had once seemed physically indestructible become increasingly fragile. Yet Freddie's voice could still fill the room. Brian later remembered worrying that the show must go on might be too demanding for him to sing. Freddie reportedly dismissed the concern. took a drink, and delivered a vocal filled with the strength the song required. That determination affected everyone around him. Roger responded in the way he understood best. He wrote. The song that emerged was gentle, almost conversational. It looked backward toward childhood, family, and the years that seemed ordinary while people were living through them. Roger called it, "These are the days of our lives." Sus! It was not originally written as a formal farewell from Freddie. Roger was thinking about his own children and about the speed with which life passes. But once Freddie sang it, the words carried a different weight. In May 1991, Queen gathered to film a music video for the song. The set was kept simple. There were no stadium crowds, elaborate costumes, or large theatrical movements. Freddie wore a waistcoat decorated with cats and stood under controlled studio lighting. His face was thinner, and his body showed the effects of his illness. The video was presented in black and white, softening some of the visible signs of what he was enduring. Roger sat behind the drums only a short distance away. He had known Freddie when they were young men selling clothing in Kensington Market. He had watched him invent the name Queen, command Live Aid, and turn audiences of more than 70,000 people into something that moved at the signal of his hand. Now, Freddie was conserving enough strength to complete one more performance. Near the end of the video, he looked directly into the camera. "I still love you." Then he smiled, snapped his fingers, and moved out of the frame. Those became Freddie Mercury's final words on camera. Roger could not have known exactly how audiences would remember that moment. He only knew that his friend was still working and that the time remaining to them was painfully short. On November 23, 1991, Freddie released a statement confirming that he had HIV and AIDS. He said that he had kept the information private to protect those around him and asked his fans to join the fight against the disease. The following day, Roger prepared to visit him. Before he arrived, the telephone rang. Freddie had died at Garden Lodge, his home in Kensington. He was 45 years old. For years, Roger had sat behind Freddie and watched him control entire stadiums. Now, there was no stage, no audience, and no final conversation. There was only the call, the journey that ended too soon, and a goodbye Roger would spend the rest of his life wishing he had been able to say. Less than 5 months after Freddie Mercury's death, Roger Taylor walked onto the stage at Wembley Stadium and looked out at more than 70,000 people. The date was April 20th, 1992. The stage was familiar. Queen had performed at Wembley before, including the concerts that followed their unforgettable appearance at Live Aid. But this night was different. Freddie was not waiting in the wings. He would not run toward the crowd, raise one arm and take control of the stadium with a single note. This time, his image appeared on the screens above the stage. The Freddie Mercury tribute concert brought together some of the largest names in music. David Bowie, Elton John, George Michael, Annie Lennox, Robert Plant, Roger Daltrey, and members of Metallica were among those who came to perform. Each guest stepped into songs that audiences associated with one voice and one personality. No one attempted to become Freddie. That would have been impossible. Roger played through the concert beside Brian May and John Deacon, surrounded by musicians who respected what Queen had created. The event raised awareness about AIDS at a time when fear, misinformation, and prejudice still shaped much of the public conversation surrounding the disease. For Roger, however, it was also something more private. It was the first time he had faced a Queen-sized audience without the man who had always stood in front of him. There were moments of celebration. The crowd sang. The lights moved across Wembley. George Michael delivered a powerful version of Somebody to Love, while Elton John and Axl Rose joined the surviving members for Bohemian Rhapsody. But every song reminded Roger why the concert was happening. When the final notes disappeared, the question facing the remaining members became unavoidable. What exactly was Queen now? Roger and Brian still wanted to work. John Deacon felt differently. John had always been the quietest member of the group. He disliked much of the attention that followed fame and rarely appeared comfortable during interviews. Freddie had often acted as a bridge between John and the larger, more theatrical world surrounding Queen. After Freddie died, that bridge was gone. Roger later explained that John could no longer cope with the pressures of remaining in the music business. He participated in the tribute concert and made a small number of later appearances, but something had changed permanently. The three surviving members still had one final responsibility. Before his death, Freddie had recorded as many vocals as his health allowed. Some were complete. Others existed only as isolated performances, waiting for arrangements. Roger, Brian, and John returned to those recordings and began the difficult process of constructing an album around the voice of a man who was no longer able to approve what they were doing. The result was Made in Heaven, released in 1995. Working on the album meant listening repeatedly to Freddie's final vocals. Every breath, unfinished phrase, and studio sound carried the knowledge that there would be no new performance after it. For Roger, the studio had once been a place of argument, jokes, and competition. Now Freddie's voice came through the speakers while his chair remained empty. The album allowed Queen to complete work their friend had fought to leave behind. It also made the finality of his absence impossible to ignore. John's last major contribution came soon afterward. In 1997, Brian wrote No One But You, a song dedicated to Freddie and to others who had died too young. Roger sang part of the lead vocal. John returned to play bass. It was the final recording made by Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon together as Queen. After that, John stepped away. He did not hold a farewell press conference. He did not announce an elaborate retirement tour. He simply withdrew from performing and returned to private life. Roger and Brian respected his choice, but respect did not make the loss easier. The four men who had once traveled, recorded and argued together were now reduced to two public members. Freddie was dead. John was alive, but absent. Queen still existed as music, a business and a memory, yet the human structure beneath it had broken apart. John continued to receive information about important decisions involving the band. He retained the ability to approve or reject major projects, but he no longer wanted the stress of creating, touring, or appearing publicly. For Roger, the silence must have felt strangely familiar. First, he had lost Freddie in a single afternoon. Then, slowly and without a funeral, he lost John from his daily life as well. The tragedy of Queen did not end when the world learned Freddie Mercury had died. It continued quietly as another member disappeared from the stage, leaving Roger and Brian to decide whether preserving the band meant continuing without half of the people who had created it. Roger chose to continue, but before Queen could return to the stage, he would have to answer the question that followed every new singer and every new concert. Could Queen move forward without pretending that Freddie Mercury could ever be replaced? When Roger Taylor and Brian May eventually returned to the stage under the Queen name, they understood that every decision would be questioned. Some fans wanted the music to continue. Others believed Queen should have ended permanently when Freddie Mercury died. No matter who stood beside them, comparisons were unavoidable. Their first sustained attempt came with Paul Rodgers, the former singer of Free and Bad Company. Roger and Brian respected him because he did not imitate Freddie. His voice, appearance, and stage presence were entirely his own. They toured together and released new music, but the partnership was always presented as Queen with Paul Rodgers, not as a replacement for the original band. Years later, Adam Lambert entered their lives almost by accident. Brian and Roger first performed with him during the final of American Idol in 2009. Lambert was young, theatrical, and capable of singing Queen's most demanding songs. But what mattered most was that he understood the impossible position he was entering. He did not pretend to be Freddie. When Queen and Adam Lambert began performing regularly together, images of Freddie remained part of the show. His voice was sometimes heard. His face appeared on the screens. During Love of My Life, Brian often allowed the audience to sing, while footage of Freddie reminded everyone who had first carried those words across the world. Roger remained behind the drums, looking out at people who still knew every line. The crowds were different now. Some had seen Queen during the 1970s. Others had discovered the band through their parents, films, streaming services, or old concert recordings. Teenagers stood beside men and women who remembered buying Bohemian Rhapsody as a single. That continuation did not erase what had happened. John Deacon still chose privacy. He remained connected to Queen's business decisions and retained a voice in important matters, but he no longer wanted to record, tour, or participate in the daily work of maintaining the band. Roger and Brian respected that boundary. Still, there must have been moments when Roger looked across a stage and remembered the exact positions of the other three men. Brian on one side, John standing quietly with his bass, Freddie moving between the piano and the edge of the platform, always watching the crowd. Only two of them were still there. Roger also began sharing the stage with someone who represented a very different kind of continuity. His son Rufus became a professional drummer, performed as part of the Queen and Adam Lambert touring production, and later joined the Darkness. At some concerts, father and son played together. For Roger, who had once learned his craft in local halls around Cornwall, the sight of Rufus behind a second drum kit made the passage of time visible. Freddie had even helped choose Rufus's middle name, Tiger, creating one more small connection between Roger's family and the friend he lost. By 2026, Roger had reached 77, but he had not quietly disappeared. He announced another solo album, the seventh of a career that began outside Queen in 1977, along with a limited series of British performances. The voice was older. The face had changed. The force behind the drums could no longer belong to the young man seen in grainy footage from the Rainbow or Hammersmith Odeon, but he was still making music. That same year, another part of Queen's past was prepared to return. The band's 1986 concert in Budapest, filmed during the Magic Tour, was restored in 4K with newly mixed sound for cinema audiences. The performance captured Queen near the end of their final tour with Freddie, when all four members were still together and playing with the confidence of a group that appeared unstoppable. For Roger, watching that restored footage meant seeing a world that no longer existed. Freddie was alive. John was still on stage. Brian stood beneath the lights with the red special. Roger himself was 37 years old, striking the drums while thousands of people behind the Iron Curtain sang along to songs they had often discovered through recordings that were difficult to obtain. The images had been cleaned and sharpened. The past itself could not be. Roger Taylor's tragedy was never a single dramatic collapse. It was the gradual disappearance of the people and circumstances that had defined most of his adult life. He lost Freddie without giving him the final goodbye he wanted. He watched John retreat from the public world they had built together. He continued performing songs created by four men, while knowing that the original four would never occupy the same stage again. Yet Roger did not abandon the music. Every time the opening rhythm of Radio Gaga begins, thousands of hands still rise together. Every time These Are the Days of Our Lives plays, Freddie's final appearance returns. Every time Roger sits behind the drums, the sound connects the Queen that existed then with the audiences listening now. At 77, he is no longer simply the young blonde drummer at the back of the stage. He is one of the final guardians of a story that began in rehearsal rooms, market stalls, and small London clubs before growing larger than any of them expected. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is also the reason people continue to watch him. Roger Taylor kept the heartbeat of Queen alive, even after half of the band was no longer standing beside him. When you hear Queen today, which memory returns first? Freddie's voice, Brian's guitar, John's bass, or Roger's drums? Share your memory in the comments and subscribe for more stories about the artists whose music became part of our lives.